Please tell us where you're watching from. Leave your city or country in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Margaret Hayes sat in the upscale Boston restaurant, watching the snow fall through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and wondered, not for the first time, why she'd let her sister talk her into this blind date. At 52 years old, Margaret had made peace with solitude. After 28 years of marriage that ended when her husband left her for a younger woman, she'd spent the last 3 years rebuilding a life that felt, if not complete, at least stable and sufficient. You can't spend the rest of your life alone, her sister Linda had insisted over coffee 2 weeks ago. Robert, my husband's colleague, he's distinguished, intelligent, recently retired from government work. Perfect for you. I'm perfectly fine alone. You're hiding. There's a difference. Linda had fixed her with that big sister look that still worked despite both of them being well past 50. One dinner. What's the worst that could happen? Now, waiting in an expensive restaurant she'd never have chosen herself, Margaret could think of several worst-case scenarios. Awkward conversation, forced politeness, the inevitable moment when he'd glance at his watch and realize he had somewhere else to be. The reminder that at 52, with gray in her auburn hair and lines around her eyes that no cream could erase, she was effectively invisible to most men. The maitre d' approached with a gentleman in tow, and Margaret felt her stomach tighten. This was it, the point where she could still claim illness, make excuses, flee to her comfortable townhouse and her comfortable solitude. But the man being escorted to her table made her pause. Robert Crawford was perhaps 58 or 60, with silver hair that suggested he'd been dark-haired once, and the kind of bearing that spoke of military or diplomatic service. Tall, maybe 6'1", with broad shoulders that filled out his charcoal suit jacket with understated elegance. But it was his face that caught her, weathered in a way that suggested he'd lived a full life, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting at horizons, and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile easily. He looked, Margaret thought with unexpected recognition, exactly as lonely as she felt. Mrs. Hayes? His voice was deep, measured, with the careful diction of someone who'd spent years choosing words precisely. I'm Robert Crawford. Thank you for agreeing to this dinner. Margaret, please. She shook his offered hand, noting calluses that belied his expensive suit. And I should warn you, my sister arranged this without consulting me much beyond threatening bodily harm if I didn't show up. Robert's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. Linda is remarkably persuasive. She cornered me at a reception 3 weeks ago and didn't accept no until I'd agreed to at least one dinner. He sat across from her with careful precision. I should also warn you that I haven't been on what you'd call a date in approximately 30 years. My social skills may be somewhat rusty. The honesty surprised Margaret. Most men would have pretended confidence, smoothness. Robert Crawford was admitting vulnerability within the first 2 minutes. It was either refreshingly honest or a very clever strategy. 30 years? That's quite a gap. I was married for 28 years. Divorced 2 years ago. Something flickered across his face. Not quite pain, more like the memory of pain long since processed. And I spent the 2 years since convincing myself I was perfectly content alone. Until Linda cornered you at a reception. Until Linda cornered me at a reception, he agreed. She's remarkably difficult to refuse. I suspect it's a skill developed through years of managing a successful law practice. The waiter appeared to take drink orders. Margaret requested white wine, something moderate, nothing that suggested she planned to drink through this evening. Robert ordered scotch, neat, then added water when it arrived, diluting it carefully. A man who wanted the appearance of drinking without the actual impairment, Margaret noted. Interesting. So, Robert said once the waiter had departed with their dinner orders, shall we handle the obligatory biographical exchange? Or would you prefer to skip directly to more interesting conversation? I'm not sure I know what interesting conversation looks like anymore. It's been rather a while since I've had to make small talk with a stranger. Then perhaps we skip small talk entirely. Robert leaned back slightly, studying her with eyes that were disconcertingly perceptive. Linda mentioned you were an art history professor before your divorce. Do you still teach? Part-time. I took a position at a small private college after the divorce. Less prestigious than my previous university appointment, but more flexible hours. It gives me time for research and writing. Margaret found herself relaxing slightly. Talking about work was safe, familiar territory. I'm currently working on a book about female artists in the Renaissance who were systematically excluded from historical record. Deliberate erasure or accidental omission? Both, in different ways. Some were deliberately excluded because women weren't taken seriously as artists. Others were simply forgotten because they didn't fit the narrative historians wanted to tell about the period. Margaret paused, recognizing the passion creeping into her voice. Sorry. I tend to get rather invested in my subject. Don't apologize. It's refreshing to hear someone speak about something with genuine passion rather than polite interest. Robert's expression had softened slightly. I spent 30 years in work that required carefully modulated emotions and calculated responses. Authentic enthusiasm is rather rare in that world. What world was that, exactly? Linda mentioned government work, but was frustratingly vague about details. Robert's slight smile returned. Linda was being discreet, which I appreciate. I worked for the State Department in various capacities, mostly overseas postings in diplomatic security and intelligence liaison. It sounds more glamorous than it was, mostly sitting in embassy offices reviewing reports and attending tedious meetings. Margaret suspected that was a significant understatement. Men who looked like Robert Crawford, who moved with that particular careful awareness and spoke with that specific precision, didn't spend careers sitting in embassy offices, but she appreciated the discretion, the refusal to boast or dramatize. Their food arrived. Margaret had ordered salmon, Robert a steak prepared simply. They ate in companionable silence for a few moments, before Robert spoke again. Linda mentioned you have children. Are they in Boston? And there it was, the question Margaret had been dreading, the reminder that she was 52 years old with an adult daughter who rarely called, still processing her own anger about the divorce, the acknowledgement that Margaret's life had contracted significantly after her marriage ended, leaving her with far less than she'd expected at this stage. Something rebellious rose up in Margaret, a desperate impulse to sabotage this evening, before it could become something that might actually matter, before she could start hoping that maybe, possibly, she wasn't too old or too damaged, or too set in her solitary ways to build something new. Actually, Margaret heard herself say, I have 5 children. 5 boys, actually. Ages ranging from 30 down to 16. The youngest still lives with me. Quite a handful, teenage boys. The house is complete chaos most days. The lie came out smoothly, almost convincingly. Margaret watched Robert's face, waiting for the inevitable reaction, the polite mask that would slide into place, the internal calculation about whether he could make an excuse and leave immediately, or if he'd have to suffer through dinner first. The relief in his eyes that she'd given him an easy out from this awkward situation. But Robert's expression didn't change. He took a sip of his diluted scotch, set down the glass with deliberate care, and said, 5 sons. That must keep you busy. Margaret blinked. It does. Constantly. There's always something. Sports practices, school events, teenage drama. Honestly, I'm not sure why I agreed to this dinner. I really don't have time for dating or relationships or whatever this is supposed to be. I see. Robert cut a piece of his steak with surgical precision. And yet, here you are. Here I am. But really, I should probably be honest with you. I'm not actually looking for anything. I just came to satisfy my sister. But between 5 boys and my teaching and my research, I'm stretched quite thin. Adding someone else to my life would be complicated. She was overdoing it now, piling on reasons why this couldn't possibly work, waiting for Robert to nod politely, finish his meal quickly, and escape back to his own presumably peaceful, child-free existence. Instead, Robert set down his knife and fork and looked at her directly. Margaret, may I ask you something? Of course. Why are you lying to me? Margaret felt her face flush hot. I'm not. You are, and rather elaborately. Robert's tone wasn't accusatory, just observant. Linda mentioned you had 1 daughter who lives in California. You've made no mention of 5 sons in any of your published academic work that I could find. And yes, I looked up your publications before tonight. More importantly, your body language changed completely when I asked about children. You tensed, looked away, and then made a decision that I can only interpret as self-sabotage. Margaret stared at him, caught between mortification and something that might have been relief at being seen so clearly. You researched my academic publications? Of course, when agreeing to dinner with a stranger. Basic due diligence seems reasonable. Your work on Renaissance female artists is impressive, by the way. The article you published last year in Art History Quarterly was particularly insightful. You read my article in Art History Quarterly? I have significant time on my hands since retiring, and I find art history fascinating, even if my own knowledge is limited to what I picked up living in various European capitals. Robert picked up his fork again. But you're deflecting. Why the elaborate lie about 5 sons? Margaret took a long sip of her wine, buying time. The honest answer, that she was terrified of actually connecting with someone, that she'd rather sabotage this evening than risk discovering she was still capable of hope, felt too vulnerable to voice. But Robert Crawford's disconcertingly perceptive eyes suggested he'd see through any further deception. Because, Margaret said finally, at 52 years old, after a marriage that ended when my husband decided I'd become boring and middle-aged, I've gotten rather comfortable with solitude. And this dinner, despite my best efforts to approach it cynically, was starting to feel like it might actually be pleasant, which is terrifying. So you invented 5 fictional sons to ensure I'd lose interest. That was the plan. Yes, I see. Robert was quiet for a moment, and Margaret braced herself for the polite but distant conclusion to the evening. Instead, he said, Margaret, may I be entirely honest with you? Given that you've just called me out on lying, I suppose turnabout is fair play. I'm 59 years old. I spent 30 years working in intelligence. Not diplomatic security, not embassy liaison, but actual field operations in places that most people couldn't find on a map. I've been shot twice, stabbed once, and had more close calls than I care to remember. I've made decisions that cost lives and lived with consequences that still wake me at 3 a.m. He paused, his expression distant for a moment. My marriage ended because my wife, understandably, got tired of being married to someone who was never actually present, even when he was physically home. I've spent the last 2 years in a very nice house in Cambridge, reading extensively, and telling myself I was content with solitude. Margaret felt her throat tighten. Why are you telling me this? Because Linda cornered me at that reception and told me about you. About how you'd been treated shamefully by a man who didn't appreciate what he had. About how you'd rebuilt your life with dignity and grace. About how you were perhaps the most interesting person Linda knew, and also the most determined to remain alone. Robert met her eyes, and I thought perhaps you and I might understand each other. 2 people who'd become comfortable with solitude, because it felt safer than risking connection again. That's a rather elaborate assumption based on Linda's description. Perhaps. Or perhaps I recognize something in your faculty photo on the college website. A particular expression I see in my own mirror. The look of someone who's survived and adapted, but not necessarily healed. Margaret found herself unable to look away from Robert's steady gaze. And what if I prefer survival and adaptation to the risk of further damage? That's entirely your choice. But Margaret, I didn't drive through a snowstorm to Boston for dinner with someone who had 5 sons and a chaotic household. I came because Linda suggested that perhaps, just maybe, I might meet someone who'd understand what it's like to rebuild yourself at an age when you thought you were already finished building. Someone intelligent and accomplished, who didn't need rescuing or fixing, but might occasionally appreciate companionship from someone equally scarred by life. That's quite a speech. I've had 2 years to practice various speeches in my head. That's what extensive solitude does. Gives you time to prepare for conversations that may never happen. Robert's slight smile returned. Though I hadn't prepared for you to invent 5 fictional sons. Despite herself, Margaret laughed. That was rather absurd, wasn't it? Gloriously absurd. I particularly appreciated the detail about teenage chaos. Very convincing. I'm mortified. Don't be. Self-sabotage is a time-honored tradition among people who've been hurt badly enough to develop excellent defensive mechanisms. Robert gestured to the waiter for more wine. The question is whether you're willing to set aside the fictional sons and actually have a conversation. I promise I'm not looking for anything except the possibility of interesting company occasionally. No pressure. No expectations beyond perhaps a second dinner if this one doesn't end in complete disaster. Margaret studied him. This silver-haired man who'd read her academic articles and seen through her clumsy lies and was offering something that felt both terrifying and oddly safe. Companionship without demands. Connection without expectations of repair or rescue. All right, Margaret said slowly. No fictional sons. Just me, 52, divorced. One daughter who's still processing anger about her parents' split, teaching part-time and writing about forgotten female artists. Rather set in my ways and not particularly interested in being anyone's project or redemption arc. Perfect. I'm 59, retired intelligence officer, 2 years divorced. 3 adult children scattered across the globe who I see approximately twice a year, also set in my ways, thoroughly enjoying living alone, and absolutely not looking for someone to fix or be fixed by. Robert raised his glass. To two people who are perfectly content alone but might occasionally enjoy dinner together? Margaret raised her own glass, surprising herself with a genuine smile. To occasionally enjoying dinner together. They touched glasses, and something in Margaret's chest, some tightness she hadn't realized she'd been carrying, eased slightly. Story continues with their developing relationship, maintaining the mature, contemplative tone for 50-plus readers, building toward approximately 5,000 words total, with their eventual choice to build something meaningful together, despite their fears and scars. The conversation that followed felt remarkably easy. They talked about books. Robert was working through Proust. Margaret had recently rediscovered Jane Austen. About travel. His work had taken him to dozens of countries, while her academic research had brought her to smaller European cities where Renaissance archives lived. About the peculiar challenge of building a life at an age when society suggested you should already be settled. Do you miss it? Margaret asked as dessert arrived. The intelligence work? Robert considered this carefully. I miss the sense of purpose, the feeling that what I did mattered, even if I couldn't tell anyone about it. But I don't miss the cost, the moral ambiguity, the isolation, the way it hollowed me out over time. He looked at her directly. I spent 30 years becoming very good at reading people, at understanding motivations and deceptions. It made me excellent at my job and terrible at having actual relationships. Coming home to my wife, I'd analyze her like a target, rather than simply being present with her. Eventually, she quite rightly decided she'd had enough. My husband told me I'd become boring, Margaret said quietly. That I'd lost my spark, whatever that means. Apparently, spark translates to woman young enough to still find him fascinating. Then your husband was a fool who didn't recognize what he had. Gallant of you to say. Not gallant, honest. I've read your work, Margaret. You think deeply, write beautifully, and bring forgotten voices back into historical conversation. That's not boring. That's remarkable. Robert paused. And the fact that you're sitting here inventing fictional sons to escape an uncomfortable situation suggests you have plenty of spark, just perhaps spark that's been suppressed because it wasn't safe. Margaret felt unexpected tears prick her eyes. That's rather insightful for someone who claims to be terrible at relationships. I'm excellent at analyzing people, terrible at actually connecting with them. There's a significant difference. Well, you seem to be doing reasonably well at connection tonight. That's because you're making it easy. No pretense, no games, just honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. I appreciate that more than you might realize. They finished dinner slowly, neither rushing to end the evening. When the check came, they negotiated briefly about splitting it before agreeing to each pay their own portion. Adults with resources, not requiring traditional gender roles about who pays for what. Outside, snow was still falling, coating Boston's streets in white. Margaret pulled her coat tighter while Robert gestured toward the parking garage. May I walk you to your car? Actually, I took the T. I don't like driving in snow. Then please let me drive you home. I have an all-wheel drive vehicle, and experience driving in much worse conditions than this. Margaret should have refused, should have maintained proper boundaries, avoided the intimacy of a car ride home. Instead, she nodded. Thank you, that would be kind. Robert's vehicle was a practical Volvo sedan, not flashy but well-maintained. The interior was immaculate except for a book on the passenger seat, Proust, as he'd mentioned. Sorry, Robert said, moving the book to the back seat. I've been reading at stoplights. Probably terrible for traffic safety, but In Search of Lost Time requires constant attention, or you lose the thread entirely. You're reading Proust voluntarily? Not for a class or social obligation? Entirely voluntarily. I decided retirement should include tackling books I'd always meant to read. Proust, Cervantes, all of Dickens. I'm working chronologically through Western canon literature like it's an assignment. He pulled carefully into traffic. My children think I've become eccentric. I prefer to think of it as finally having time for things that matter beyond immediate operational necessity. What did your children think of the divorce? Mixed reactions. My daughter was supportive. She'd seen how absent I was during her childhood, understood why her mother needed to leave. My sons were more conflicted. They'd grown up with the mythology of Dad, the important government official doing secret important work. Having to acknowledge I was also Dad who failed at marriage was difficult. Robert navigated the snowy streets with confident ease. Do you see your daughter much? Not often. She lives in San Francisco, works in tech, calls on birthdays and holidays. We're cordial but not close. I think she blamed me, initially, for the divorce. Thought I should have tried harder, been more interesting. Whatever would have kept her father from leaving. She's coming around slowly to understanding it was more complicated than that. That must be painful. It is. But she's entitled to her feelings, her process. I can't force reconciliation or understanding. I can just be available when she's ready. Margaret glanced at Robert's profile, illuminated by streetlights. This is very strange, you know. What is? This conversation. I've spent 3 years avoiding exactly this kind of vulnerability with anyone. And here I am, telling a near stranger about my strained relationship with my daughter. Perhaps that's why it's possible. I'm a near stranger with no previous context or assumptions. And you know you'll likely never see me again after tonight. So there's freedom and honesty. Is that what you think? That we'll never see each other again? Robert was quiet for a moment, focused on navigating a tricky intersection. I think that's entirely up to you, Margaret. I'd very much like to see you again. But I also recognize that this evening has been rather intense, and you may well decide that companionship isn't worth the emotional risk it requires. And you? Is companionship worth the risk for you? I think it might be. For the first time in 2 years, I'm considering that perhaps contentment alone isn't the same as actual happiness. That having interesting conversations with an intelligent person might be worth risking the comfortable equilibrium I've established. Margaret directed him to her townhouse in a quiet neighborhood near the college. Robert pulled into her driveway but left the engine running, not presuming anything. "Thank you for dinner," Margaret said. "And for calling me out on my absurd lie about 5 sons. Most people would have simply made an excuse and left. Most people haven't spent 30 years learning to read when someone is scared rather than disinterested. You're not disinterested, Margaret. You're terrified. There's a significant difference. Perceptive and honest. Dangerous combination. Is it?" Robert turned to face her fully. "Margaret, I'm going to be completely transparent with you. I find you remarkably interesting. I'd very much like to see you again. Another dinner. Perhaps a museum visit, since we both appreciate art. Whatever feels comfortable. But I'm also aware that I'm 59 years old, with significant emotional baggage, and a career that left me rather damaged in ways that may not be immediately apparent. If you'd prefer to end things here, I'll understand completely. No pressure, no expectations." Margaret sat with this for a long moment. Through her front window, she could see her comfortable living room, the books, the comfortable furniture, the life she'd built that required nothing from her except what she chose to give. Safe, predictable, increasingly lonely, if she was honest with herself. "I'm free next Saturday," Margaret heard herself say. "There's a new exhibition at the Museum of Fine Arts on Baroque female painters. If you'd like to go, I could meet you there at 2 o'clock. Robert's face transformed. Not a full smile, but something close. Pleasure mixed with surprise. "I'd like that very much. Fair warning, I can be insufferable at museums. I tend to lecture. I'm counting on it. How else will I learn anything useful?" He pulled out his phone. "May I have your number, in case plans change or I'm running late?" They exchanged numbers with the slight awkwardness of adults unused to these rituals. Then Margaret gathered her things and opened the door, pausing before stepping out into the snow. "Robert, thank you for seeing through my lies, and for making it safe to be honest. Thank you for being brave enough to be honest despite being terrified. That's rather remarkable." Margaret walked to her door, aware of Robert waiting until she was safely inside before pulling away. She stood in her quiet entryway, coat still on, heart beating faster than she'd expected. She'd just agreed to a second date. At 52 years old, after 3 years of determined solitude, she'd just agreed to see again a man who'd read her academic articles and called her remarkable and seemed genuinely interested in conversation rather than just filling empty space in his life. It was terrifying. It was also, Margaret admitted to herself, rather exciting. The week before their museum date passed with surprising speed. Margaret found herself thinking about Robert at odd moments. His careful way of speaking, his admission that his work had hollowed him out, the way he'd seen through her defensive lies without judgment. Twice she picked up her phone to cancel, convincing herself this was foolish. She was too old, too set in her ways, too comfortable alone. But she didn't cancel. And on Saturday at 2 o'clock, she stood in the Museum of Fine Arts lobby, nervously straightening her coat, wondering if Robert would actually show up or if he'd had second thoughts during the week. "Margaret," his voice came from behind her, warm with what might have been relief. "I was afraid you'd cancel." She turned to find Robert in casual clothes, well-fitted jeans, a navy sweater, a leather jacket that looked expensive but worn. He looked younger somehow, less formal, Still carried himself with that particular awareness, but more relaxed. "I was afraid you'd cancel," Margaret admitted. "I almost did. 3 times. Decided I was too old for this. You'd realize I was boring. I should stick to reading Proust alone." Robert smiled, a real smile this time, reaching his eyes. "But I really wanted to see you again." "I really wanted to see you again too," Margaret said quietly, "which terrifies me. Shall we be terrified together while looking at Baroque female painters?" They moved through the exhibition slowly, Margaret explaining context and technique, Robert asking thoughtful questions that suggested genuine interest rather than polite tolerance. He'd clearly researched the artist beforehand, mentioned details about Artemisia Gentileschi's life that most people wouldn't know, asked intelligent questions about attribution and historical exclusion. "You did homework," Margaret observed, as they stood before a particularly striking Gentileschi painting. "I told you I had time on my hands, and I wanted to be able to hold up my end of the conversation." Robert studied the painting. Judith beheading Holofernes, all dramatic violence and psychological intensity. The power in this is remarkable. The way she makes violence feel like justice rather than brutality. Gentileschi was raped by her art teacher, and then put on trial where she was tortured to verify her testimony. Her paintings of strong women enacting violence against men take on different meaning in that context. Art as both documentation and revenge. Art as reclaiming power, perhaps. Margaret found herself standing closer to Robert than strictly necessary in the museum crowd. The forgotten female artists I write about. Many of them were using art to claim space in a world that wanted them silent and invisible. There's something profound about bringing their work back into conversation centuries later. You're doing for them what they couldn't do for themselves, making sure they're remembered. That's rather poetic for a retired intelligence officer. "I contain multitudes," Robert said dryly. "Years of pretending to be various people in various places taught me to access different aspects of myself depending on context. Some of those aspects even involve appreciation for art and poetry." They spent 3 hours in the museum, talking about art and history, and the ways stories get told or suppressed. Robert bought a catalog of the exhibition, then suggested coffee at a small cafe near the museum. Over cappuccinos, the conversation shifted to more personal territory. Robert told her about his children, his daughter Sarah, who worked for Doctors Without Borders, his son James, who taught high school history in Oregon, his youngest son Michael, who was still trying to figure out what to do with his life at 32. "They're all remarkable people who succeeded despite having a largely absent father," Robert said. "I gave them financial support, occasional advice, but not much actual presence. That's something I regret deeply." "Can you rebuild those relationships now?" "I'm trying. Sarah and I talk weekly now. She's forgiven me, mostly, for the ways I failed her mother. James is more distant, still processing. Michael," Robert sighed. "Michael is angry in ways I don't fully understand yet, but I'm learning to be patient, to be available without pushing. It's a different skill set than I developed in my career." Margaret talked about her daughter Jennifer, about the complexity of watching your child become a stranger, about the guilt of a failed marriage's impact on your children regardless of whose fault the failure was. "I keep thinking I should have tried harder," Margaret admitted. "Should have been more interesting, more accommodating, whatever would have prevented my husband from needing to trade me in for a newer model. But then I think, why should I have had to change everything about myself just to keep someone who clearly didn't value who I actually was? You shouldn't have. That's not love. That's conditional acceptance at best." Robert reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, but close. "Margaret, from everything you've told me, your husband left because he was having some sort of crisis about aging and relevance, and chose to blame you for his own dissatisfaction. That's not your failure. That's his. You sound very certain. I spent 30 years analyzing human behavior and motivation. Your ex-husband's pattern, successful professional man in his 50s leaves long-term wife for younger woman, is boringly predictable. It's about his fear of mortality and irrelevance, not about any actual deficiency in you." Robert paused, "which doesn't make it hurt less, I realize, but it might help to understand it wasn't actually about you at all. That's both comforting and depressing." "Most truth is," Robert finally did touch her hand briefly, "for what it's worth, I find you far more interesting than I've found anyone in a very long time. Your intelligence, your passion for your work, your honesty about being terrified, all of it suggests someone who's done the hard work of surviving and still maintained their essential self. That's rare and valuable." Margaret felt tears threatening. You should probably stop saying such nice things. I'm not accustomed to it and don't know how to respond. Then don't respond. Just accept that I mean it. Robert withdrew his hand. Would you like to have dinner? There's a small Italian restaurant near here that's supposed to be excellent. They spent another 3 hours over dinner and wine, the conversation flowing easily through topics ranging from books to politics, to the peculiar challenges of being alone in your 50s after decades of partnership. Robert made her laugh with dry observations about his attempts to learn cooking. I can prepare 7 different dishes competently, and I eat them on strict rotation like a very organized person with no imagination. Margaret shared her own learning curves. I'd never managed household finances before. My husband always handled it. Learning at 50 felt rather infantilizing. When Robert finally drove her home, the snow had started again. They sat in his car outside her townhouse, both reluctant for the evening to end. I'd like to see you again, Robert said. If you're willing. I am. Though I have to warn you, I'm going to keep being terrified intermittently. I may panic and say something absurd like inventing fictional children again. I'll try to see through whatever defensive mechanisms you deploy. Robert smiled. And I may occasionally go silent and distant, because 30 years of intelligence work trained me to share nothing. You'll have to call me out when I do that. We're rather a pair, aren't we? Both thoroughly damaged in complementary ways. Perhaps that's why this might actually work. We understand damage. We've both done the work of surviving. We're not looking for rescue or repair, just companionship from someone who understands. Robert turned to face her fully. Margaret, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm 59 years old, and I didn't expect to feel this way about anyone again. The possibility of actually caring about someone, of building something real, it terrifies me. But it also feels like maybe life isn't quite finished offering opportunities for happiness. Margaret reached across and took his hand. I'm 52, and I'd convinced myself I was done with all of this, that I'd had my chance at love and partnership. It ended badly, and solitude was the sensible choice going forward. But Robert, these 2 evenings with you have reminded me that being safe and being happy aren't the same thing, and maybe, just maybe, I'm brave enough to risk being happy again. Even if it means risking being hurt again? Even if, though I'd appreciate if you could try not to hurt me. I've had rather enough of that. I promise to try very hard not to hurt you, and to be honest enough that if I'm about to hurt you through ignorance or thoughtlessness, you'll see it coming and can tell me to stop being an idiot. Margaret laughed. That's perhaps the most realistic romantic promise I've ever heard. I'm too old for romantic promises I can't keep, but I can promise honesty, effort, and genuine interest in building something real. If that's enough, it's more than enough. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Margaret gathered her courage and leaned across to kiss him. It was brief, tentative, the kiss of 2 people relearning intimacy after years of absence. Robert kissed back with careful gentleness, his hand coming up to cup her face. When they parted, both were smiling, real smiles, reaching their eyes. I'll call you tomorrow, Robert said. If that's not too eager. Please do. I'd like that. Margaret walked to her door, aware of Robert waiting until she was safely inside. She stood in her entryway, coat still on, fingers touching her lips where he'd kissed her, and allowed herself to feel something she hadn't permitted in 3 years, hope. 6 months later, Margaret and Robert sat in his Cambridge house, larger than her townhouse, filled with books and comfortable furniture and the accumulated artifacts of a life lived internationally. They'd fallen into a pattern of spending weekends together, alternating between his house and hers, building something that felt both new and comfortably established. I've been thinking, Robert said, setting down his book. They were both reading in companionable silence, something they'd discovered they both enjoyed, about the future, about whether living in 2 separate houses makes sense long-term. Margaret's heart rate increased. Are you suggesting we move in together? I'm suggesting we talk about whether that's something we'd both want. Eventually. Not immediately. We're both too set in our ways for immediate cohabitation, but perhaps as something to work toward. My daughter called last week, Margaret said. First time she'd called in a month. She asked about you. Said Linda had mentioned I was seeing someone. And what did you tell her? That I was seeing you. That you were kind and intelligent and made me happier than I'd been in years. That you read my academic articles and actually seemed to enjoy them. That you understood what it was like to be terrified of hoping for something good. Margaret set down her own book. She said she was glad, that she'd been worried about me being alone. My daughter said something similar, that she'd never seen me this relaxed, this present, that whatever I was doing, I should keep doing it. Robert reached for Margaret's hand. So I thought perhaps we should talk about what we're building here, whether it's just comfortable companionship or something more permanent. I think, Margaret said slowly, that it started as comfortable companionship and has become something more. Something I didn't expect to want again, but find I very much do want. She squeezed his hand. I love you, Robert. That terrifies me, but I love you. Robert's face transformed with emotion. I love you too. More than I thought I was capable of loving anyone after my divorce. You've reminded me what it feels like to be fully present in my own life, rather than just occupying space. So what do we do with that? We take our time. We keep building what we're building without rushing. We acknowledge that we're both complicated people with histories and children, and lives that don't easily merge. Robert pulled her closer. But we also acknowledge that this matters, that finding each other was unexpected, and valuable and worth protecting. I can agree to that. Margaret settled against him. Though I have to confess something. What? Sometimes I think about that first dinner, about how I invented 5 sons to sabotage the evening, about how absurd and transparent and desperate that was. She laughed softly. What if you'd believed me? What if you'd politely finished dinner and never called? I wouldn't have believed you. Your face when I asked about children. You looked like someone who'd been hit, not like someone casually discussing 5 sons. The lie was obvious from the first sentence. And you asked me out for a second date anyway. I asked you out for a second date because of it. Because it showed me you were scared, which meant you were feeling something. And because anyone brave enough to sabotage herself so elaborately deserved a second chance to try honesty. Robert kissed her forehead. Best decision I ever made, seeing through your terrible lies. Best decision I ever made, being bad at lying. They sat together in comfortable silence. 2 people who'd survived their 50s with various damages and scars, who'd convinced themselves they were content alone, who'd been surprised by unexpected connection, not perfectly healed, not magically fixed by love, but whole enough to build something real together. Margaret thought about the woman she'd been that snowy evening 6 months ago, determined to sabotage any possibility of connection, convinced she was too old and too damaged for new beginnings. She thought about Robert's patient seeing through of her defenses, his own admission of damage and loneliness, his willingness to risk hoping again. Sometimes, Margaret thought, the best things in life come from failed self-sabotage, from being seen clearly despite your best efforts to remain invisible, from finding someone equally scared and equally brave enough to try anyway. She'd lied about having 5 sons to ruin a date. He'd asked her out anyway, and somehow, impossibly, they'd built this, 2 damaged people creating something whole together, one honest conversation at a time.